There's a small room just off the service hallway in my building. Nothing remarkable about it. Bare walls, two bins, a narrow chute, the faint smell of detergent and cardboard. It's where we take our trash and recycling. And like clockwork, it reveals a pattern about human behavior that never stops fascinating me. Every week, I notice the same divide. A few of us, maybe 3 or 4 residents in total, break down our cardboard boxes, stack them neatly against the wall, and make sure our recyclables are in the right bins. We slide our trash bags down the trash chute and wipe up whatever might have spilled. The rest? They walk in, toss their boxes onto the floor, leave the trash sitting wherever it lands, and close the door behind them, as if the mess evaporates. No one's watching, no cameras, no confrontation, just a private moment with public consequences. What's interesting is who these people are. This is not a struggling neighborhood by any means. It's fairly comfortable, upper middle class building full of professionals, people who, by any reasonable measure, know better. Many have advanced degrees, children, opinions about community. Yet that awareness doesn't seem to translate into action. And that's the real psychological puzzle. Why do some people act as if the rules still apply when no one's watching, while others behave as though accountability disappears the moment the door closes? The trash room is only the stage. The same divide shows up on the roadways. Drivers who obey the speed limit on an empty street versus those who drive as fast as they can simply because no one's around. It shows up in workplaces. The person who leaves the coffee pot empty or walks away from the jammed printer versus the person who takes 60 seconds to make a new pot of coffee or fix the coffee machine for the next person. It shows up in daily courtesies, whether someone holds the door or lets it slam because they're a few steps ahead. These moments may seem trivial, but together they tell us something profound about moral psychology. They reveal how people relate to the commons, the shared spaces, rules, and responsibilities that hold social life together. When a person leaves trash on the floor, they're not just skipping a chore. They're silently announcing how they perceive their relationship to everyone else. For some, that relationship is reciprocal. I'm part of the system, so I'm going to care for it. For others, it's transactional. I pay for this. Let someone else handle it. Psychologists have long known that morality doesn't depend primarily on education or knowledge or intelligence. It depends on internalization. Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development describe this gradient. At the lowest level, people act to avoid punishment or to gain reward. At higher levels, they act for social approval, doing what's acceptable in the eyes of others. Only a very small minority reach what he called post-conventional reasoning. This is the ability to act from self-authored principles, even when no one is watching. That's the difference between following rules and owning them. When responsibility becomes internal, behavior stabilizes across settings. The person who sorts their recycling, who keeps their speed steady, who shows up for work even when it's hard, those aren't separate virtues. They are expressions of the same internal structure, a conscience that no longer needs witnesses. So the trash room becomes a laboratory. It shows us who we are when our social masks fall away. So does the grocery store parking lot. That also becomes a laboratory. And that's where our exploration begins, because this difference between those who care for the commons and those who exploit it isn't random. It grows from a mix of psychological forces, how we learned responsibility, how we regulate emotion, and how we see ourselves in relation to others.
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. R.J. Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
When we talk about responsibility, we usually frame it in moral or social terms. We think of it as character, upbringing, or decency. But psychologically, responsibility is something more precise. It's a regulatory function. It's how we manage the tension between immediate comfort and long-term consequence. Some people have developed what we could call internal governance, an invisible structure that keeps their actions aligned with principle, not impulse. For these folks, the right thing is not situational. It's simply how they move through the world. Others rely on external governance. They need rules, supervisors, visible reward, or threat of punishment. When those disappear, these folks, their behavior drifts. It isn't necessarily malicious, it's adaptive. They've learned that morality is something you perform when being watched, not something you inhabit for who you are. This internal structure doesn't appear from nowhere. It's often built in childhood. It might come from modeling, watching parents who also cared for the commons, who returned the shopping cart, who picked up litter without being asked. It can come from agency, being given real responsibilities and seeing the direct consequences, good or bad, of one's actions. And it can grow from trust, a foundational belief that the system is fair and that your contribution matters, rather than a cynical view that the system is rigged and there's no point in trying. Psychology has a language for this divide. Julian Rotter called it the locus of control, the degree to which people see themselves as agents of their own actions. An internal locus of control, you see, gives rise to accountability. I influence outcomes. My behavior matters. An external locus fosters detachment. Life happens to me. Someone else is in charge. That detachment doesn't only shape behavior, it shapes empathy. When a person sees their actions as disconnected from impact, they lose the felt sense of belonging to a shared system. The trash room doesn't feel like ours. The road doesn't feel like a collective space that we share. The workplace becomes a transaction, not a community. This loss of ownership is amplified by a mechanism Albert Bandura called moral disengagement. This is what allows people to temporarily silence the part of themselves that knows better. They rationalize. It's not my job. I'm in a hurry. They pay someone else to do this. Now, once that self-justification takes hold, conscience goes quiet. The truth is that conscience is not a light switch. It's a muscle. If you stop using it, it weakens. And this is where emotional regulation enters the picture. To act responsibly often means tolerating small moments of friction, taking the extra minute to do something right, absorbing criticism without quitting, resisting the urge to speed or to lash out, returning the grocery cart. Those moments demand self-regulation, the ability to manage discomfort instead of offloading it onto the environment. Psychological research on executive functioning and impulse control shows that conscientious behavior is rarely about virtue. It's about emotional endurance. People who can sit with discomfort don't need to escape it by breaking rules or abandoning structure. Think of the person who leaves the empty coffee pot. On the surface, it seems like simple laziness. But underneath, it's often a failure of that same self-regulation. It's an inability to tolerate the small friction of a 60-second task that benefits others. Resisting that urge to pass the buck, to make your convenience someone else's problem, that requires that same emotional endurance. By contrast, the conscientious employee, the one who takes the time to make a new pot of coffee, return the grocery cart, they don't do so because they're immune to annoyance. They do so because they can regulate it. Their identity isn't contingent on whose job it is. It's contingent on being a person who contributes. This same mechanism explains why some drivers maintain the speed limit when they're alone on the road. It's not about fear of tickets. It's about internalized order. Their sense of control doesn't come from the presence of others. It comes from congruence within themselves. Now, what's striking is how consistent this pattern is across contexts, whether it's a trash room, a highway, a workplace, their own home. The underlying variable is the same. Is morality a social performance, or is it a form of self-regulation? Most people live somewhere in between. They behave well when the social mirror is present, but drift when it's gone. But those who consistently care for the commons, who take responsibility even when unseen, reveal a deeper psychological integration. Their behavior is not an act of compliance. It's an act of coherence.
Step back in time to Cape Side, Massachusetts, where the questions that defined a generation still echo. Who am I? What do I want? And how do I become the person I'm meant to be? In The Psychology of Dawson's Creek, Love, Identity, and Growth in Cape Side, psychology professor R.J. Starr takes you beyond the heartbreaks and creekside conversations to reveal what was really happening beneath the surface of this groundbreaking series. Through the lenses of Erikson's stages of development, Bowlby's attachment theory, and Marcia's identity statuses, Starr unpacks how Dawson, Joey, Pacey, Jen, Jack, and Andy each became portraits of adolescence in motion, searching, fumbling, and finding themselves in real psychological time. You'll see Joey's struggle for identity, Dawson's confrontation with loss, Pacey's longing for self-worth, and Jack's journey toward acceptance not as television tropes, but as universal human experiences. Each chapter bridges psychology and pop culture, showing how the series captured something timeless about love, resilience, and the fight to understand who we are. Whether you grew up with Dawson's Creek or are just discovering it now, this book offers a deeper look at why those stories still resonate. It's part cultural study, part emotional mirror, and all heart. The Psychology of Dawson's Creek, Love, Identity, and Growth in Cape Side. Available now wherever books are sold. Revisit the series that helped a generation grow up and rediscover the psychology that still lives in all of us.
Now, once you start noticing this, you see it everywhere. The streets littered after a festival. Grocery carts abandoned in parking lots. The shared kitchen at work full of half-empty coffee cups left for someone else to clean up. None of it is catastrophic, but together it reflects something larger, a slow erosion of the psychological bond between self and society. There's a concept in sociology called the tragedy of the commons. It describes what happens when individual self-interest depletes a shared resource, when people act as if their small contribution to the problem won't matter. But psychologically, this tragedy doesn't begin in economics, it begins in perception. When people stop feeling like stakeholders, they stop behaving like caretakers. In modern life, that detachment is easy to maintain, right? We live inside systems designed to absorb our neglect. Trash disappears down a chute. Water keeps flowing. The building has staff. The city has crews. The lights come on. Someone else, somewhere, will handle things. The infrastructure that was built to serve us now anesthetizes us. Now, to be clear, this isn't always a failure of character. Sometimes it's a failure of capacity, okay? Modern life depletes our emotional and cognitive resources. For example, the single parent with a sick child and a looming deadline might not have the executive functioning left to break down a box. But when neglect becomes a habit rather than an exception, it signals that outsourced conscience has taken root. And the more insulated we are by comfort and affluence, the stronger that anesthesia becomes. That's the paradox of environments like mine. The residents are educated, informed, often articulate about social issues. Yet the very privileges that make their lives easier also dull their moral reflexes. When everything functions automatically, when labor is invisible, empathy fades. Responsibility feels optional because consequence feels distant. I sometimes call this outsourced conscience. It's the psychological habit of substituting payment for participation. We believe that if we've paid the dues, we've paid the rent, we pay taxes, we've fulfilled our social contract. Responsibility in this case becomes transactional, not relational. But community, real community, doesn't work that way. It depends on visible acts of care that remind people they're part of something shared. Not smoking in common areas, throwing your trash, putting your trash in the right receptacles, breaking down your boxes, returning the grocery cart. The moment those acts disappear, the commons start to decay, not physically at first, but psychologically. And yet, within the same environments, there are always a few people who resist that drift. They sweep the hallway after the wind blows in. They keep their noise low at night. They return the shopping cart, not because someone might scold them if they don't, but because it aligns with how they understand themselves. These people form what we might call the conscientious minority, a small group who hold the fabric together by doing unglamorous, unseen work. They often feel frustration, even resentment towards those who don't. But underneath that frustration is a kind of quiet integrity. They refuse to externalize conscience because they've learned that if you wait for others to care, you'll be waiting forever. Psychologically, this minority operates from self-authored morality. Their standards are not dictated by social approval or cameras present or no. They come from internalized identity. And identity is the most durable source of moral action we have. When people stop identifying with the systems around them, responsibility collapses. That's why workplace disengagement, civic apathy, and neglect of shared spaces often rise together. They're symptoms of the same emotional disconnection. There's also a feedback loop at play. When we see others neglecting responsibility, our own motivation declines. Social psychologists call this normative disinhibition. The environment signals no one else cares, and we follow suit. A clean space invites care. A messy one excuses it. Each act, responsible or not, becomes contagious. So the social mirror cuts both ways. We take cues from one another. We either reflect conscientiousness or we amplify decay. In that sense, every shared space, whether a building, a company, a community, every shared space becomes a test of collective maturity. It asks whether enough people will sustain invisible labor to keep the environment coherent, or whether self-interest will hollow it out. And maybe that's why these small everyday examples matter so much. They are practice grounds for civilization itself. In the end, all of this, the trash room, the road, the workplace, the parking lot, isn't really about rules. It's about who we are when structure falls away. Psychologists call this moral identity, the degree to which our sense of self is organized around our own ethical values. For people with a strong moral identity, integrity is not a performance, it's continuity. They behave in line with their values because to do otherwise would feel like a fracture in the self. For those whose morality is externally regulated, behavior shifts within circumstance. Conscience becomes conditional. This distinction doesn't necessarily make one group inherently better. It simply reflects different stages of psychological maturity, psychological development. Some people are still learning to link behavior with belonging, to feel connected to systems larger than their own comfort. Others have already integrated that awareness. They recognize that caring for the commons, whether it's a shared space, a community, or a relationship, is not just civic responsibility, it's emotional hygiene. Because how we treat what's shared mirrors how we treat what's inside, what's internal. When we neglect the commons, we externalize our own disconnection. We say, without words, I don't see myself in this. When we care for it, we reaffirm continuity between inner and outer life. We say, in effect, this matters because I matter within it. That's the quiet psychological truth beneath all of this. Caring for the commons is a form of coherence. And since conscience is a muscle, this coherence can be practiced. It starts with simply noticing these moments: the shopping cart, the empty coffee pot, the piece of trash on the floor, the speed limit sign. Then we can practice micro acts of coherence. We can choose to frame breaking down that box not as a chore, but as an act of identity, a small private vote for the kind of person we want to be and the kind of community we want to inhabit. This is how that muscle gets stronger. I often think about how much of modern life depends on invisibility. We rarely see who cleans, who repairs, who picks up the trash, who manages the small infrastructures that let us live comfortably in this country. Our systems are efficient, but they are also emotionally anesthetizing. We've built an entire civilization on the fantasy that someone else will handle it. Yet every time a person takes the extra moment to break down their box, drive with care, share the roadway with kindness, they follow through on a commitment. They restore a fragment of connection. They remind the system that it still has a soul. The future of the commons, in every sense, depends on enough people choosing coherence over personal convenience, not out of guilt, but out of alignment. So maybe the question isn't who left this mess. Maybe it's who still feels responsible for what we all share. Because that question, repeated across 1,000 ordinary settings, quietly shapes the kind of society we become. When no one's watching and you still choose to care, you're not just maintaining order. You're preserving something human. The invisible thread between self and system, between individual conscience and collective life. And that, more than any policy or rule, is what keeps the commons alive.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.